Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere you probably wouldn't choose as a vacation spot. Europe, right after the Black Death ended. Yes, that one. The 14th century mega plague that steamrolled across continents like it was trying to set a high score in population reduction. You probably won't survive this. Not because it's scary, but because it's, well, historically dull in the best way. All creaky floorboards and melancholy wind. But that's kind of the point, right? Sleepy, strange, and slow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. I just want to keep telling stories that help you doze off, dream weirdly, and maybe accidentally learn something along the way. By the way, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city and time in the comments. It's fun seeing who's falling asleep around the world at the same time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, the year is around 1353, give or take, and the great pestilence has finally run out of gas. Picture this: fields wounded, overgrown, towns half emptied, and silence in places that used to echo with gossip, hammer strikes, and bell towers. The disease burned fast and hot, about 4 years of horror, and then like a sudden squall, it just stopped. Not but because anyone figured out how to stop it, but because it had simply torn through so many hosts that it ran out of fuel. Just death and the dust left behind. You wake up one morning and there are fewer birds on courses than you remember. That bustling Market 2 street's overgone. That old couple across the lane with their shrill cat all vanished. The cat might still be around to be fair, but the house is shuttered. The smell of rot long faded, replaced with an odd sterility, just quiet. The first thing people notice when the plague starts to ease is the unnatural stillness. It's not peace, it's aftermath. The kind of hush that settles over a place. Not because everything's fine, but because there's almost no one left to make a sound. Survivors emerge, blinking into light that feels somehow too clean. The air isn't fresh. It's stale with memory. You remember the fires in the streets, the carts of bodies, the priests reading last rites so fast they stopped bothering with names. You remember praying so hard your knees bled. And you remember when the prayers stopped feeling like they reached anything. And then nothing. The fever just doesn't come back. You get a scratchy throat and you brace for death, but it passes. You hear someone cough and don't dive into a ditch. You start to trust again just a little. But the world is altered. Everything looks like it used to, but doesn't feel the same. Shops reopen slowly. Church bells ring again, but with fewer hands to pull the ropes. People start to gather cautiously. The first weddings feel surreal, like laughter being practiced. There's joy, but it's clumsy. And oh, the smells. Decay doesn't just vanish. Streets are washed, incense burned in bulk, herbs hung from rafters like garlands at a funeral. Every survivor is obsessed with cleanliness in weird personal ways. You sniff rosemary like it's oxygen. Someone hands you a mask stuffed with lavender and calls it science. Honestly, whatever helps. A strange thing happens when people crawl out of mass disaster. They search for normality like it's treasure. They pick up old habits and wear them like armor. Bakers bake, Smith. Children, fewer, sadder, quieter, chase chickens and mud puddles again. Your cousin tries to host a feast, and even though half the food is burnt and nobody remembers how to dance, and it still feels sacred. And then there's the question no one dares speak aloud. Now what? With nearly half the population of Europe gone? Yes, half. The old systems don't just reboot, they stall. Cities are missing officials. Towns lack farmers. Guilds have no apprentice. Even graveyards feel overworked. The church, still standing, but bloodied, tries to reassert control. Bishops write letters. Monks copy psalms. But faith, like everything else, has changed. People saw too much. Prayers didn't work. Saints didn't save anyone. And yet people still go to church. You go, even though you're not sure what you believe anymore. Maybe it's habit. Maybe it's fear. Or maybe, just maybe, it's because humans are strangely good at surviving, even emotionally. You sit in a pew next to someone you don't recognize. You mumble the Latin words half-heartedly. You don't expect a miracle this time. What's strange is how fast the rebuilding starts. Not grand rebuilding, not castles and cathedrals, but the small stuff. Mending shoes, harvesting grain, nailing roof slats. Someone opens a tavern just for survivors. Every drink has a morbid name like the last cough or widow's brew. You try to laugh, and it sort of works. Here's a historical fact. In some towns, survivors held mock funerals for the plague itself. Actual processions with coffins labeled death and actors dressed as skeletons. It was part exorcism, part party, like collectively spitting in the face of the monster that just left. A fringe thing that shows up. People claiming they were immune because of holy visions or weird diets or magical rocks tucked in their socks. One guy insists garlic saved him. Another swears it was bee stings. Everyone has a theory, and all of them are wrong. But no one's arguing too hard. Who can prove anything anymore? And there's a scholarly debate still simmering about just why the plague faded when it did. Was it herd immunity? Did the disease mutate into a weaker form? Did rats and fleas shift patterns? Maybe it was just pure math. Too few people left to infect. Historians still puzzle over it, and likely will for decades more. You, of course, don't know any of that. You just know the world feels bent out of shape, but you're still here breathing, eating, waking up, and doing it again. The wind sounds different now, but maybe it's just your ears healing from all the wailing. The worst has passed, but normal. Yeah, that's going to be something new entirely. The chairs are still there, but no one's sitting in them. That's the first thing you notice when the dust begins to settle. How much space is suddenly available? At first, it's subtle. Fewer footsteps in the alley behind the bakery. More silence at the dinner table. Then it's everywhere. Entire families are just missing. A friend says they went to visit a cousin. You both know it's not true. You walk into a tavern that used to buzz, and now it sounds like a church at midnight. Tables that once hosted spilled beer and bad lute music sit covered in a fine film of dust. And even the barkeep talks softer, like the walls are listening. There's room to stretch out now physically, emotionally. But it's not the comfortable kind. It's the kind that makes your skin itch. Like the air is too big for your lungs. And when people do sit, they don't fill the space the same way. They huddle tighter. They speak slower. Eye contact lasts longer because who knows if this conversation is the last one again. Everyone's still remembering the sound of lungs filling with fluid. You watch the way old neighbors pour wine like it's a ceremony. No more sloshing drinks onto the floor. Every drop is a prayer now. But here's the thing. With all those empty chairs, the ones left standing suddenly matter more. You're alive, and so are they. And whether you want it or not, you're all part of something new. Families are stitched back together from whoever's left. Cousins marry because the family line needs to keep going. Strangers become kin because they're all that's around. A baker's daughter ends up adopted by a traveling smith. No one bothers with the paperwork. There's no one left to check it anyway. This strange reweaving of human connection isn't elegant. It's patched and awkward, but it works. There are more godparents now than ever before. People start naming their children after the dead, not out of tradition, but out of necessity. A baby named after 6 different uncles. A girl with her mother's name, her aunt's name, and her grandmother's. All stacked like armor. Labor changes too. With fewer hands to do the work, every surviving body becomes valuable. Peasants, yes, the same ones once seen as background noise, start to matter. You, a humble field worker, are suddenly being courted like a minor celebrity. Landowners lower rents, offer better pay, even bring food to your doorstep just to convince you to stick around. It's weird, honestly. In some towns, workers refuse to come back at all unless the terms change. And they do. Wages rise. Hours shorten. You feel in your knees. This is the first time you've worked and not felt like an invisible cog. You start asking questions you didn't dare before. What if I don't want to plow this guy's field anymore? What if I want to work in town? Maybe try weaving or brewing. What if I want to leave? That's a new thought, leaving. Before, people didn't move much. You lived where your father lived, did what your grandfather did, died in the same dirt they tilled. But now the rules feel softer. The landowners are desperate. You have options, and it tastes like freedom, even if you're not sure how to use it yet. Historical fact. In the years following the Black Death, many manors and estates found themselves nearly empty. Some were entirely abandoned. Landowners wrote letters begging for laborers while some villages simply vanished, absorbed by forests or left to crumble. Archaeologists still stumble across them. Collapsed stone huts hidden in overgrown hills, or their silence louder than a scream. The strangest thing is that in the middle of all this loss, there's opportunity. You start to hear rumors of people buying land, not nobles, but commoners. That's unthinkable just a few years ago. But now, with so many gone, inheritance laws are in chaos. Titles are tangled, and anyone with a few coins and a bit of nerve can slide into power. It's not common, but it's possible. And in a world where possibility used to be a cruel joke, that matters. Of course, not everyone's thrilled about this. The nobility, oh, they hate it. The idea that a serf could demand a better wage, blasphemy. So they start passing laws, sumpter laws, wage controls, rules meant to keep people in their proper place. In England, there's even an ordinance that says no worker can demand more pay than they did before the plague. As if time didn't just shatter the world. This leads to some tension. You hear whispers in the fields, mutterings in the alehouses, talk of pushing back, of organizing. Nothing dramatic yet, but the seeds are planted. You feel it when you talk to your neighbor, when you see the way she looks at the empty manor house down the road. There's a flicker of thought. Why not us? On the fringe, as some start wearing nicer clothes, not extravagant, just better tailored. A shoemaker in will dyed blue instead of brown. A milkmaid in earrings. People start acting like their lives might matter, and that in its own quiet way is revolutionary. Meanwhile, the emotional side of things remains a slow slog. You're still attending funerals months after the plague ends for those who made it through the worst but couldn't recover. The trauma doesn't end when the fever does. You still dream of black boils and coughing fits. You still flinch when someone sneezes. Scholars still debate whether this shift in labor dynamics directly led to the end of serfdom. Some say yes, this was the beginning of the working class gaining autonomy. Others argue it was just a temporary blip, a wound the system patched eventually. But on the ground, right here, right now, it feels like something broke open. Even if you can't name it, you find yourself sitting in one of those empty chairs. Finally, the fire's burning low. Someone's ladling out stew. You're not sure what happens tomorrow. But tonight you're warm. You're fed. You're alive. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough for now. You wake up before dawn, not because you want to, but because someone's knocking at your door. Is the steward from the estate up the road? His hat in his hands, his tone almost polite. That's new. He wants to know if you'll come back to the fields. They're a mess, he says. Overgrown, choked with weeds, half sown by boys barely old enough to tie their own shoes. They'll pay you to assure what you used to make and maybe throw in a side of bacon. You don't say yes right away. You let them wait. That's also new. Across the countryside, similar conversations unfold. Landowners, once lofty and distant, now make rounds themselves or send their most agreeable servants to do it. The math isn't hard. Fewer people means fewer workers. Fewer workers means desperate employers. For the first time in living memory, the ones holding the plows are holding a kind of power. You can feel it in your bones. The feudal world, lords above, peasants below, is wobbling. It's not crashing down yet, but it cacks when the wind blows. You're a peasant. At least that's what they have always called you. But suddenly, that word doesn't carry quite the same weight. Suddenly, your choices matter. You can go to the next village and get hired there instead. You can ask for more pay, for better shoes, for a bit of land to call your own. In the aftermath of disaster, survival has made you valuable. Here's your historical fact for the night. Across England and much of Europe, wages for agricultural laborers rose dramatically in the decades after the plague. In some regions, they doubled. Landowners tried to resist, but their fields were rotting and their silos were empty. They had no choice. Of course, nothing good comes without strings. Those in power weren't exactly thrilled about the New World Order, and the ink on new laws dried almost as fast as the fields withered. Kings and councils began drafting ordinances to freeze wages to make it illegal for you to demand more than you earned before the plague. One such law in England, the Ordinance of Labour's 1349, declared that no one should be paid more than customary wages. You can almost hear the nobility scoffing as they wrote it. But out in the real world, it's a joke. Customary wages. Those were based on a world where labor was as abundant as dirt. Now it's scarcer than saffron, and you know it. Everyone does. You see in the markets, too. People from classes that never used to mingle are now buying and selling alongside each other. That arrogant merchant who never looked you in the eye before now tries to remember your name because you've got coin now and he wants it. Social order becomes a little slippy. The lines blur. The clothes don't match the class anymore. In a small but oddly satisfying twist, some peasants start dressing better. Well, better for them. They wear brighter colors, finer cloth, longer sleeves. Nothing flashy enough to get them thrown in jail, but just enough to make people look twice. Of course, the elite notices. Laws get passed telling people what they can and can't wear based on their station in life. That's right. Sumptuary laws. Imagine being so mad about someone wearing green that you make a crime. But deep down, the anger isn't about clothing. It's about power. The plague knocked the chessboard over. And now the pawns are walking around like they might be bishops someday. That scares people. It makes them nostalgic for the good old days. Which is funny considering those days involved famine, endless war, and zero hand washing. Fringe fact. In some parts of Europe, landowners got so desperate they resorted to bribing peasants with weird incentives. One village reportedly offered a skilled plowman a year's worth of beer, his own oxen, and even the hand of a widow with a decent dowry. You laugh when you hear the story, but also that's a pretty solid package deal. The real change, though, is quieter. It's not in the laws or the wages. It's in the conversations whispered over fences and shared in stables. You hear neighbors talking about pooling money, about leaving town together and starting a new life elsewhere, about hiring themselves out on their terms. You begin to hear words like freeman, tenant, sharecropper. These are new roles, strange hybrids between lord and laborer, where work is still hard, but that the balance of control has shifted just a little. There's still fear. You worry that this won't last, that the rich will find a way to push things back to how they were. And they'll try. Don't doubt that for a second. But something cracked during the plague, and no amount of soul of royal decrees can fully seal it up again. Open scholarly debate time. Some historians argue that the Black Death was the true beginning as of the end for feudalism. Others say it simply accelerated changes that were already brewing. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. But when you're standing knee-deep in a barley field that you chose to work, turning twice what your father did, it sure feels like a turning point. One day you pass by a manor house that used to buzz with activity. It's quiet now. Half the windows are boarded, the hedges untrimmed. The family inside is smaller, the servants is fewer. And when the lady of the house walks past you on the road, she nods. Nods as if you're equals. You go home with dirt under your nails, but there's a smile tucked behind your cracked lips. You earn more today than ever before. You'll have meat with your supper, maybe even a bit of ale. And tomorrow, the steward coming back to talk about a longer-term contract. Funny, isn't it? The plague came to destroy, and it did. But in its wake, it also shuffled the deck. You, the humble peasant, now hold a few face cards, and you're still learning how to play them. You never thought fashion would matter after the end of the world. And yet, here you are, watching your neighbor's son strut down the village lane in a tunic dyed deep crimson, like blood, but expensive. Everyone turns to look. The cloth hangs too fine on a farm boy's frame. The sleeves too long, the boots too clean. It's almost laughable, except no one's laughing. They're squinting. They're curious. They're wondering if they could pull it off, too. Clothing of all things becomes a battleground. After years of death and dirt, people crave something, anything beautiful. You start to see little bursts of color among the grays and browns. Sashes tied, just for decoration. Hems embroidered with gold thread. A girl adds a brooch shaped like a flower skull to her cloak, and it starts a tiny trend. There's a defiance in it. The plague took everything. It doesn't get your sense of style, too. You even catch yourself caring. You shake the lice out of an old wool tunic and wonder if you could afford something dyed this season. Maybe a deep green if you're feeling bold. Not that you know what this season even means. There are no fashion magazines, just gossip and glances. But the urge to look alive, to feel alive, burns stronger than you expected. Artists, few as they are now, begin to pick up their tools again. The fresco on the chapel walls used to be all saints and halos, but the new ones, they're darker. Skeletons dancing, corpses and crowns, nobles and beggars side by side in death. It's called Dance Macabre, and suddenly it's everywhere. The idea is simple. Death doesn't care who you are, but underneath it there's a strange comfort. We all die, sure, but we all live too while we can. And if you want to wear red silk to your next mass, no one dares stop you anymore. You're a historical fact. After the Black Death, Europe saw a surge in memento mori artwork. Paintings, carvings, even jewelry reminding people of their mortality. Skulls, hourglasses, decaying bodies rendered in painstaking detail. Sounds grim, but it wasn't about despair. It was about remembering. About pulling death close enough to hold it, then saying, "Fine, I see you. Now move." Fringe fact for you. One noble woman in France commissioned a gown embroidered entirely with images of dancing skeletons and flaming swords. She wore it to dinner parties. People were scandalized. She became a minor icon. No one ever invited her to weddings, but her portrait was copied endlessly. But the real transformation runs deeper than fabric. It's in how people begin to value the senses. Perfume sales spike. Yes, perfume. As if the entire continent wants to smell something that isn't decay or garlic. Spices become a luxury, even among those who used to boil cabbage and call it dinner. There's a surge in music, too. Rough, imperfect songs played on fiddles and lutes by people who still remember how. You hum along, even if the notes are off-key. You go to fair one day. Yes, those are coming back. And there's a man painting faces. Children line up for smudges of red and blue across their cheeks. You see a boy painted to look like a fox, his tail tucked into his belt, and you swear it's the first time you've heard real laughter in months. Even the monks are smiling, sort of. There's a scholarly debate among art historians about whether the macabre shift in post-plague fashion and art was purely a psychological response, or if it represented the birth of a new cultural mindset entirely. Was it just grief made visible? Or was it the start of something revolutionary, like personal expression clawing its way out of centuries of uniformity? You don't know the answer. You just know that wearing blue suddenly feels like a risk and a rebellion and a reward all at once. Of course, not everyone's thrilled. The upper classes still clinging to the old ways with white knuckles, pass more sumptuary laws. They ban certain fabrics and colors for commoners. Velvet is for nobles. Silk, nobles' gold thread. Don't even think about it. But here's the funny part. They can't enforce any of it. There aren't enough guards, not enough courts, and half the judges died. You see a Thatcher's son in a fur trimmed cloak one day and think, good for him. The world's already upside down. May as well dress like a king. And then there's theory fashion. You attend more burials than you care to count. But now they've started to look dramatic. Black veils, embroidered gloves, candles in every available hand. Some towns develop entire outfits just for mourning. You wear a black sash for your aunt. A cousin wraps his shoes in wool and paints them gray. Even the graves look different. Before it was simple stones, if anything. Now people carve epitaphs with poetry. They leave small tokens, a ring, a ribbon, a sketch of the deceased's face. There's a quiet sort of artistry in death. Now, one day you come across a man carving tiny bone charms. Memento mori trinkets. He calls them. Skulls the size of fingernails. Hourglasses in amber. He tells you he started making them after his entire family died. So it was the only way to keep going. You buy one without even thinking. It jingles softly in your pocket for days like a ghost-keeping rhythm. There was still fear in the air that never quite leaves. But it's quieter now, coated in ritual and routine. You wake up. You get dressed. You try to look like someone who belongs in the world again. You start tying a little string of color around your wrist. Today it's yellow. Maybe tomorrow green. It doesn't mean anything. Or maybe it means everything. One evening you find yourself staring into a polished bit of tin that someone's using as a mirror. You don't recognize your reflection at first. Your hair is longer. Your clothes don't match. There's a tiny painted skull on your collar because apparently you're that person now. And yet there's something steady in your eyes. The plague took half the world, but the half it left behind. It's dressing up now. It's telling stories in paint and lace and laughter. It's rebuilding not just with stone, but with style. And somehow in the middle of all this grief, people are finding new ways to feel human. You walk past the church on a cloudy morning and notice something odd. The bells are ringing. Yes, but they sound different. Not because the clapper's broken or the wind is off. It's the rhythm. Slower, uneven, and when you step inside, the pews are only half full, mostly with people who look like they're still trying to remember how to pray. The altar is missing its usual glint. The incense is weak. The priest is new, young, nervous, and if you're honest, maybe just a little bit drunk. It's not that faith has disappeared, it's that it limps now. The plague didn't just hollow out towns and villages, it gutted the clergy. Monasteries collapsed, convents emptied, priests, monks, nuns gone in staggering numbers. In some places, entire church staffs were wiped out within weeks. The devout were the first to rush into infected homes to perform last rites, to anoint the dying with oil, and for their holy efforts, they died in droves. Heroically, yes. Tragically, more absolutely, but also inconveniently, because now suddenly the spiritual scaffolding holding up medieval Europe is riddled with holes. You can feel it in every sermon. The young priests now in charge are often barely trained, rush through holy orders just to keep parishes from falling into silence. Latin mispronounced, scriptures fumbled, sacraments rushed. You notice a bishop's seal scrolled hastily on vellum, authorizing someone who can barely read to become your new confessor. He blesses your bread with trembling hands. Here's your historical fact. Estimates suggest that in some areas, up to 60% of the clergy perished during the Black Death. That's more than half of the people who were supposed to connect earth to heaven. The gap left behind was filled with anyone who could mumble the right prayers and look the part. And let's just say standards slipped. You start to see it in odd places. A friar with a crooked cross tattooed on his neck. A deacon who swears louder than the blacksmith. A nun who, rumor has it, used to work at a tavern in another town and saw the light only after all her customers died. You're not judging. Who among you hasn't reconsidered life choices after mass death? But still, it's strange. The authority of the church feels less sturdy than it used to. But what's even stranger is the split. Some people cling harder than ever. They come to Mass every day like candles, like it's a competition. Wear iron crosses around their necks until their skin bruises. They want answers. They want order. They want to believe that all of this everything meant something. Others drift, not angrily, just quietly. A few start praying in private, skipping Mass, trusting in saints no one talks about anymore. There's talk of heresy and whispers, though the words lost some of its sting. You meet a weaver who's convinced the plague was a test from a forgotten angel and that God isn't in churches anymore, but in the forests. He invites you to walk barefoot through the woods with him. You decline politely. A fringe response emerges in pockets of Europe. People begin founding their own weird little religious groups. Flagellants march through towns, beating themselves with whips, chanting songs about judgment and cleansing. You see one of their processions once, blood on their backs, their faces vacant with ecstasy or exhaustion. It's hard to tell. They believe they're helping, that if they suffer enough, the world might heal. You want to believe that too, but it sounds exhausting. Scholarly debate still spins around the idea of how deeply the plague fractured religious trust. Did it spark the Reformation a century early? Did it undermine the monopoly of the Catholic Church? Or did it just rattle a few walls and leave the rest standing? Nobody agrees. But when you hear the old woman across the road mutter that priests die like the rest of us, you wonder if something larger has shifted, something deeper than just the tone of sermon. Meanwhile, the church scrambles to hold on, and papal bulls fly like arrows. Edicts are written and rewritten. One pope declares that survivors should fast twice as often. Another says they should feast actually to celebrate being spared. It's chaos. Holy chaos. And most people just nod and do whatever feels right. You start praying with your eyes open. You light candles for people who had no proper burials. You stop asking if God is watching and start asking if he's maybe just really, really tired. Here's the thing, though. Even as institutions buckle, the rituals don't die. They mutate. Funerals are held in fields instead of churches. Weddings are whispered under the stars. Confessions happen over the fences. You won't see a child baptized with a jug of cider because there's no clean water left and no priest for miles. It feels sacred anyway. Your cousin starts carrying a wooden cross carved with tiny teeth marks. It belonged to her late husband. She holds it every night like a talisman. You ask her if she still believes, and she shrugs. I believe he's gone, she says, and that I'm still here. That's something, isn't it? It is. Another day, you find yourself sitting in the back of a chapel while a service goes on. The priest stammers through the gospel reading. A baby cries, a woman sneezes, and everyone flinches. But the sun filters through a cracked, stained glass window and lands on your lap like a benediction. You can almost pretend the world is still intact. You miss the old priests, their sure voices, their ritual precision, their stern eyes that made you sit up straighter. But you don't miss the blind obedience, the fear, the idea that questioning meant damnation. You start to think maybe faith isn't a ladder you climb, but a candle you carry, flickering, imperfect, but yours. When you leave the church, you notice someone has carved a small face into the base of the stone wall. Cheeky little thing, tongue sticking out, winking at the world. You grin. Maybe God has a sense of humor after all. And even if he doesn't, you do. And for now, that's going to have to be enough. You walk into the city like a ghost returning home. You've been gone a year, maybe more. Time blurred somewhere between the coughing fits and the empty roads. And now the walls of the town loom before you like a half-forgotten memory. There's still a gate, still a watchman, though he looks more like a skeleton in borrowed armor than someone who could stop anyone. He doesn't ask your name. He just nods and waves you in like he's too tired to care who's left and who's coming back. Inside the city is quieter than you remember. The streets echo when you walk. The market stalls are fewer, the fruit bruised, the fish already beginning to smell despite the cool morning air. You pass shops with doors ajar like someone meant to return and simply never did. Some houses are boarded up, others hang signs in crooked handwriting for "Let inquire at the bakery." Don't take what you need. Do not enter. Plague took all. It's not just death that lingers here. It's absence. You feel it strongest in the silence between your footsteps. Cities used to breathe, didn't they? All bustle and sweat. Shouts from butchers, children running under carts, church bells clanging over the argument of 10,000 lives all happening at once. Now it's like someone hit the pause button halfway through a song, and no one knows how to start it again. Still, you're not alone. People are trickling back. Survivors like you returning from the countryside or neighboring towns, hoping to reclaim something of the life they left behind. You see a family painting over the plague mark on their door. A faded red X that once meant death inside. A few stalls are open. Someone's frying onions in oil that smells faintly of desperation and old dreams. The baker is back with fewer loaves and more wrinkles, but she smiles when you greet her. It's not much, but it's something. Here's your historical fact. In many cities across Europe, urban populations dropped by up to 60% during the plague years. Some towns never fully recovered. Others, especially the trade hubs, began to regrow slowly like moss after a fire. The wealthy fled to their country estates. The poor either died or scattered. Now, in the strange lull that follows, cities begin the uneasy task of rebuilding with whoever's left. Of course, city life after the Black Death doesn't just pick up where it left off. You can see it in the gaps between buildings, between people, between expectations. Entire guilds have vanished. Apprentice programs are in ruins. The Weaver's Hall has shuttered its doors. The Stonecutter's Lodge now houses goats. You used to walk past a line of cobblers every morning on your way to the square. Now there's just one, and he's drunk half the time, singing old hymns to his cat. But slowly, the machine cacks into motion again. The council meets, what's left of it anyway. New taxes are proposed, mostly to rebuild the roads and pay the handful of guards still willing to stand in the rain with a pike and a scowl. Merchants reopen shops, selling goods from dusty crates salvaged from abandoned warehouses. You find yourself doing odd jobs, carrying crates, cleaning soot from chimneys, helping restock shelves for shopkeepers too old to lift anymore. The pay isn't great, but no one haggles much. Everyone just wants things to work again. There's a fringe scene building, too. Not everyone's come back to follow the old rules. You hear rumors of squats inside abandoned manors, of artists turning plague houses into studios, of makeshift theaters in burned-out courtyards. One night, you stumble across a group of people reciting poetry by torchlight in the shell of a collapsed inn. The words are raw, strange, sometimes obscene, often beautiful. You stay until your legs go numb. It's the first time you've heard anyone speak in metaphor in over a year. And then there are the animals. Cats everywhere. Dogs that have gone half wild, slinking between alleys like thieves. Pigeons are thicker than ever, cooping on rooftops bold enough to steal bread from your hand if you're not careful. A city emptied of people doesn't stay empty. It just invites other things in. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether post-plague cities saw a net increase in innovation due to all the structural chaos, or whether the trauma simply reset society back to survival mode. On one hand, fewer people meant more opportunity. Houses were cheap, labor was valued, and guild restrictions sometimes relaxed just to get warm bodies into jobs. On the other hand, it's hard to invent the future when you're still trying to remember how to tie your own shoes without crying. You live in a rented room above a spice cellar shop now. He's old, mostly blind, and calls you by the wrong name half the time, but the rent is low, and the view of the square is oddly comforting. You watch the city from your window each morning. The butcher sharpening knives. The boy who sells onions trying to juggle them for laughs. The priest who never quite learned how to project his voice, but keeps trying anyway. You start recognizing faces. You say hello more often. Someone leaves you a bundle of carrots on your doorstep one morning, and you leave a candle in return. It becomes a quiet game of barter and kindness, unspoken and strangely sacred. It's not the city you knew. It's smaller, rougher, stranger, but it's also more tender in its own way. You can feel the hesitation in every handshake, the grief lurking just beneath every smile. And yet people are showing up, lighting lamps, opening shops, playing music on corners where the wind still smells faintly of ash. You walk home one night a little drunk and realize you haven't thought about dying in days. That feels like a milestone worth remembering. The city isn't healed, not by a long shot, but it's breathing again. Haltingly, wheezily, but undeniably alive. You're not really planning to leave. At least that's what you tell yourself the first time you pack your things. It's just a short trip. You say a chance to visit your cousin 2 villages over. Maybe sell a bit of cloth. See if the mill's still running. Nothing permanent, nothing drastic. But then the road opens up before you like a question you didn't know you were allowed to ask. And suddenly your feet keep moving. You're not alone. The roads are fuller again. Not crowded. Not yet, but busy in that nervous way a room fills after someone says something uncomfortable. There are peddlers with carts pulled by stubborn mules. Soldiers without masters looking for coin. Widows carrying everything they own in baskets woven from memory. Pilgrims head to shrines they prayed to while fevered, hoping now for some kind of answer, or at least better luck. Everyone's going somewhere else, and no one seems entirely sure why. Here's your historical fact. In the decades following the Black Death, migration across Europe surged. With populations thinned and land left, people had a rare chance to leave the villages they were born in, and many took it. Laborers walked days or weeks to find new work. Survivors reunited with distant kin. Some wandered simply because they could. You pass fields where the crops have grown wild, wheat taller than your head, reclaiming fences and footpaths. In one town, a girl is plowing land her father abandoned during the plague. Her ox is half lame, her technique all wrong, but no one stops her. There's no one to stop her. You leave her with a wedge of cheese and a soft warning. Water before noon. Rest when the shade hits the fence post. She nods, barely listening, already determined to belong here. And then there are the abandoned villages. Not ghost towns exactly. Ghosts need people to remember them. These are just empty houses with doors swinging open, hearts filled with the soft nests of birds. You spend one night in a place called Elmrook or maybe Elmburrow. It's hard to tell from the moss-covered sign. You sleep in the loft of a barn and wake up to silence, so complete it feels like snow. That's the thing no one talks about, how loud the quiet is. You try not to imagine who lived there, whether they fled or simply stopped waking up. Still, who not all movement is lonely. In some places, entire families move together, forming caravans of carts, livestock, and stubborn optimism. You fall in for a few days with one such group, 2 sisters, their husbands, and a cluster of children that seem to multiply by the hour. They sing while they walk, off-key and enthusiastic. Their songs are a strange mix of hymns and drinking tunes. You teach the youngest to whistle through his teeth. They feed you stew and stories. You help fix a broken wheel and share your dried pears. Then one morning, you wake up and they're already gone, slipped away with the dawn, their tracks barely visible in the dewy grass. Fringe fact, some nobles tried to prevent migration altogether, issuing decrees forbidding peasants from leaving their assigned lands. In response, entire groups would vanish overnight, taking tools, livestock, and sometimes even church bells with them. There are records of manors left with nothing but chickens and the echo of their own authority. Cities and towns begin to compete for workers. You reach one village where the mayor personally offers bread and a corner of land to anyone willing to stay. Another has a public feast every week just to lure people from the road. You start to realize the world has become a buyer's market for labor, for loyalty, even for presence. If you're willing to show up, someone wants you there. Still, travel isn't all freedom and fresh bread. The roads are dangerous. Bandits, yes, but also fear. Villages still wary of outsiders keep gates closed. You're turned away more than once, eyes tracking your every move as if you're dragging the plague behind you like a shadow. One town demands you strip and be inspected before entering. Another offers you lodging, then runs you out when a child wakes with a fever. You get used to the cold shoulders. You get used to sleeping under stars. But there are good days, too. A festival in a hilltop town with sweet wine and bad music. A river crossing where a toothless fisherman sings to the fish and insists it helps. A church with no roof but walls covered in flowers. Offerings left by travelers like you who prayed not for salvation but for safe passage and decent weather. And somewhere along the road, the idea of home begins to change. It's no longer tied to a village, a field, a name carved in wood above a door. Home becomes the way the sun feels on your back, the way your boots soften at the heel, the way your walking stick taps out a rhythm that almost sounds like music. There's a scholarly debate, because of course there is, about whether this period marked the beginning of the end for medieval immobility. Some argue that it shattered the idea of fixed identity. You're not where you're from, but where you are. Others say it was a blip and the old world reasserted itself soon enough. But right now, with the horizon stretched out in front of you and no one telling you where to be, it feels like possibility. It feels like air. You cross a bridge at dusk, the water below rippling like silver cloth. You sit for a while, watching the sky change color. You're not sure where you'll sleep tonight. Maybe in a chapel, maybe in a barn, maybe under that tree just off the path. But you're not afraid. The road hums softly beneath your feet like it's whispering. Keep going. And so you do. You don't know much, but somehow your satchel feels heavier with each village you pass. Not because of weight, though the turnips and the 2 wooden spoons don't help, but because of decisions. Every mile away from where you started adds a layer of questions. Where do you stop? Who are you when you get there? What does it mean to belong somewhere now? When the very concept of place feels like it's been smudged and rewritten eventually, though, you stop. Not because you plan to, but because you arrive in a village that feels like a pause rather than a stop, like a breath caught between sentences. It's called Bent Mia, or maybe Bent Mayor. The sign's too weather-worn to be sure. Sits nestled in a dip between 2 green hills, half concealed by trees that creak even when there's no wind. Smells like wet earth and goat. That's probably a good sign. You're greeted not with suspicion or ceremony, but something stranger. Paperwork. A man in a hat far too large for his thin face hands you a wax-splattered scroll and asks for your name, your skill, and whether or not you have a legal claim to any property currently held in dispute. You blink at him. He repeats the question slower, as if your brain might be stuck. Turns out this town is knee-deep in legal mess, and you've just wandered into it like a goose into a chess match. Because here's the thing nobody anticipated. When half the population vanishes and the other half runs off to find bread and better company, the land they leave behind doesn't just sit quietly, it causes problems. Whose field are these now? Who owns the smithy if the smith and his 3 sons died, but the apprentice survived and has been living there for a year? Is a chicken legally inherited if the original owner died without a will and the chicken now follows the neighbor's daughter around like a dog? Your historical fact for tonight. In the wake of the Black Death, property law became a nightmare. Wills, deeds, and tenancy records were often destroyed or irrelevant. Entire legal systems were clogged with disputes. Courts were overwhelmed with inheritance cases, contested land rights, and challenges to feudal obligations. In some towns, the only consistent thing was inconsistency. You watch it happen in Bentmere. Every third conversation includes the phrase, "That barn was his, I swear it." Or, "But the cart had my initials on it." The town clerk looks like a man who's aged 12 years in one. He keeps quills behind both ears, ink stains on his sleeves, and a permanent sigh ready at the back of his throat. And yet, despite the chaos, things move forward. Slowly, sure. Sometimes sideways, but forward. You offer to help mend fences while the ownership is figured out. It doesn't matter whose field it is if the goats are getting into everyone's cabbages. No one argues. Everyone's too tired. You meet a woman who's lived here all her life. She tells you her brother left during the worst of the plague and never came back. Now his house is overrun with blackberry vines and feral cats. "I'd move in," she says. But someone will turn up saying they're a cousin or a stepson or something. She shrugs. Easier to wait. You help her clear the path anyway, just in case. Here's a fringe fact. In some places, entire villages were resettled by strangers who simply moved in, squatted long enough, and then claimed ownership. In legal terms, it was a mess, but in human terms, it was survival. If the house was empty and you could patch the roof, it was yours. Until someone showed up with a sword or a document to say otherwise. Of course, not everyone's honest. You hear stories. A man passing through pretended to be a noble's son, claimed an estate, and lived there for 6 months before being found out. Another bribed a half-blind notary to forge a deed. The town magistrate now requires 2 living witnesses for every claim. You joke that soon they'll start asking ghosts for confirmation. No one laughs. One man mutters, "Wouldn't be the strangest thing we've seen." Meanwhile, marriages become legal puzzles. Widows remarry without proof of their husbands' deaths. Later, the husbands show up thin, coughing, but very much alive. Chaos ensues. Who gets the land? The second husband? The first? The widow who frankly just wants to live somewhere without a fight. A scholarly debate lingers over whether this legal chaos helped birth more flexible systems of property law, or if it simply exposed how fragile the old feudal claims have been all along. Some say it was the beginning of private ownership in the modern sense. Others argue it was just a temporary scramble. All you know is that if you find an empty house with a chimney that still draws, you're probably going to start moving your turnips in. You settle in for a bit, help rebuild a roof, fix a spinning wheel. A family takes you in, more out of mutual convenience than affection. You earn your keep. After a while, someone asks if you'd like to stay. You don't say yes. You don't say no. You just keep doing what you're doing, and that seems to be enough. In the evenings, people gather to sort through scraps of parchment and argue over old boundaries. You sit in the back, chewing on a route and listening to debates that would have been laughable 5 years ago. The fence was here. No, but it was 2 steps that way. I remember because there was a goose that bit anyone who got close. Testimonies based on geese in fence posts and whose dog barked when. It's ridiculous, but it's real. The town begins to redraw itself, not with maps, but with action. You start seeing new fences, new roof tiles, new smoke from chimneys that hadn't seen fire since the plague came. The blackberries are trimmed. The goats are fenced. The cats, of course, remain untamable. You realize something watching the village take shape again. Maybe ownership isn't about paperwork at all. Maybe it's about presence, about who shows up, who fixes things, who lights the fire and keeps the door from creaking. And for the first time in a long while, you start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, you found somewhere you could belong. You wake to the sound of a rooster who clearly believes he's the town crier, shrieking like the sun owes him money. Bent Mere, or whatever name you've settled on by now, has warmed to you in its own slow, skeptical way. The townspeople no longer flinch when you pass, and a few have even started referring to you as our outsider, which sounds almost affectionate, if not fully welcoming. You've patched roofs, settled disputes over apple trees, and even been asked to judge a pie contest that ended in 2 grandmothers not speaking for 3 days. So yes, you're blending in, but the truth is something bigger is shifting. And it's not just you. It's everything. It's the very bones of the world beneath your feet. Because the feudal order, the system that was supposed to last forever, ordained by God and cemented by generations of blood and land, is beginning to crack like cheap plaster under too much weight. It's hard to miss. Lords who used to ride through town like they own the air now arrive with fewer guards, smaller retinues, and more notably, questions. They need workers. They need tenants. They need people. And that need makes them polite. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to notice. You've watched a knight offer a handshake to a shepherd. You've seen a baron agree to lower taxes on a mill just to keep the wheels turning. You used to fear them. Now you just wonder if they know how to thatch a roof. Here's your historical fact. The Black Death drastically weakened the rigid social hierarchy of feudalism. With a massive labor shortage, lords were forced to compete for peasants, offering better terms, reduced rents, and even small plots of land. Things unheard of in the rigid days before the plague. Serfs began to realize they had leverage. And once that door creaked open, it didn't close again. Binter's own lord, Sir Gildan, a man with a name that sounds fancier than the reality, used to visit twice a year, demanding grain and oaths of loyalty. Now, he shows up monthly, hat in hand, literally. His estate is in shambles. His steward died. His horses have been sold. He now carries his own ledger and asks without snarling if you'd be interested in leasing a parcel of land on the eastern slope. The rent is fair. Too fair. Desperate, really. You tell him you'll think about it. You don't tell him you've already started planting onions there. You notice the subtle rebellions happening around you. The baker's son, once bound by custom to apprentice with his father, decides he wants to make candles instead. And no one stops him. The widow who'd been cleaning floors for the manna refuses a summons. So she's got her own work now. Thank you very much. A pig farmer paints his door red, despite the Lord's decree that only households of noble favor may use that color. The paint drips a little. It's glorious. The rules are still there. The old order still technically exists, but it's become soft, pliable. You can bend it now, and it bends surprisingly easily. Of course, not everyone is pleased. You overhear older villagers grumbling about upstarts and fools thinking they're free. They mutter about divine order, but how things were meant to be, but even they don't enforce it. They just mutter and keep muttering until they get distracted by a chicken or a leaky roof, a fringe detail. In some areas, nobles try to reassert dominance with the elaborate pageants and ceremonies, attempting to reign still awe and reverence through pomp. One earl held a 3-day festival complete with flaming banners, wild boar-themed deer, wild boar feasts, and hired actors to portray the natural order of man. It worked until a group of peasants left halfway through to go negotiate better wages elsewhere. You can feel the shift in conversation, too. People would speak less of obligation and more of choice. A man who once served the manor says he might move north. A girl asks you what it's like to live in a city. You don't even have to tell them to dream bigger. They already are. And still the structure hasn't collapsed. Not yet. There are taxes to pay, titles to respect. Bows still offered when the Lord rides by, though now they're a bit shallower, a bit quicker. There's still danger in pushing too far, too fast. You've heard of villages where rebellion met sword. One man hung for stealing a foul field. Another whipped for refusing to return to the manor after harvest. The old world fights to keep breathing, but it's coughing. There's a scholarly debate, because of course there is, about whether the decline of feudalism was a natural evolution sped up by plague, or a slow erosion that happened regardless. Some point to charters and laws passed in the wake of the pandemic, codifying freedoms once unthinkable. Others argue the system reinvented itself, cloaked in new titles, but still rooted in inequality. You don't have parchment or titles, but you know what you see. More heads held high, more no thank yous. You will have spoken without fear. One evening after supper, the villagers gathered to talk, not about crops, but about rules, real ones. They sit on logs and stones, and someone pulls out an old ledger from before the plague. It's half burned, full of outdated names. They start discussing who should decide what in the village, who should manage the grain store, who should resolve disputes. No one mentions the Lord. Not once. It's not defiance, it's absence. The most radical thing is how natural it feels. You offer to take notes, they nod. Later that night, under a sky so clear it feels like the stars are leaning in to listen, you realize something. This isn't just about land or money. It's about ownership of self, about people who used to be bound now, feeling their own edges, learning their own weight in the world. Bentmere may still belong to a lord on paper, but in practice it belongs to the people who wake up each day, fix its fences, bake its bread, and decide where the path should run. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough revolution for now. You sit on a bench beside the village square, chewing a hunk of bread that's half crust, half brick. It's not good, but it's warm, and these days, that's all you really ask for. Across from you, the baker's wife argues with a tanner over the price of boots, while two children toss rocks into a bucket and call a game. The square's alive in that oddly quiet way everything is now, busier than it was during the worst of the plague, but still missing the hum it once had. You watch or you listen, and you think about something that's been tugging at your sleeve for weeks now. What even is money anymore? Before the plague, life ran on a strange mixture of currency, some unaccustomed and futile obligation. You worked land you didn't own, gave crops you couldn't keep, and somehow owed taxes in 3 different directions. Most people lived on barter and favor, trading eggs for thread, plowing for bread, nursing the sick in exchange for firewood. Coin was around, sure, but not for the likes of you. It existed in ledgers, locked chests, church vaults. Now you've got silver in your pocket. Real silver. Earned, not inherited. The baker accepts coin. So does the thatcher. The tavern has started posting prices on a chalkboard instead of shouting numbers and adjusting based on who walks through the door. You even heard someone mention a fixed wage. A wage. You used to be a body tied to land. Now you're a worker with a price. Here's your historical fact. After the Black Death, wages across Europe rose sharply. With the labor pool decimated, surviving workers could demand more pay, better terms, and in some cases, radical thought, low thought, choice. Coins circulated more widely among the lower classes, and a rigid class barrier that kept money out of peasant hands started to erode slowly. But noticeably, markets are the new battlefield. Lords still want dues paid in grain, eggs, or labor. But merchants prefer coin. It's cleaner, faster, and oddly democratic. Penny doesn't care if your grandfather was a pig farmer or a knight. And as the plague loosened feudalism's chokehold, currency slipped in to fill the vacuum. Bentmere now hosts a market twice a week, and it's beginning to feel like a little republic of its own. Sellers set prices. Buyers haggle. Everyone's pretending like this has always been normal, like they weren't handing over cabbages to avoid being whipped a few years ago. You trade a sack of barley for 2 candles and a smaller curious knife with a chipped bone handle. No oaths, no blessings, no taxes to the manor, just a deal done. But this new economy isn't without its awkward growing pains. People aren't used to pricing their labor. One man demands 10p to dig a well, then undercuts himself the next day because someone said it felt steep. A midwife charges a hen per birth, then switches to copper coins, then back to hens when she finds out the blacksmith's wife has the nicest chickens. You once watched a full-on negotiation over a cow breakdown because both parties valued different coins more based on how shiny they were. It's chaos. Delicious experimental chaos. Fringe fact. Some local economies created their own coins post-plague. Wooden tokens, stamped lead discs, even dyed cloth slips used in markets when official coinage was scarce. In one town, they used slices of dried mushroom marked with ink. Trade them in before they mold. No refunds. Currency changes behavior, too. People walk differently when they carry money. Heads higher, back straighter. You've seen neighbors puff up when they count out their coins slowly, deliberately, just to be seen doing it. One boy buys a bright yellow scarf, just because he can. He looks like a dandelion and couldn't be prouder. And with coin comes saving. That's new. You find yourself tucking away 2 or 3 pieces each week in a hollow under your floorboards. Not because you need them now, but because you might need them later. You start to think in terms of future purchases. That phrase didn't exist in your vocabulary before. It's a quiet kind of freedom, but the tension's still there. The nobility sees this shift happening and hates it. In cities and court halls, there's talk of clamping down. New statutes try to set fixed wages. Lords pass laws forbidding laborers from charging excessive rates. One decree claims anyone who refuses to work for customary pay can be arrested. You read that and laugh until your sides hurt. Then you go and work for double what you use to just spike the ink. There's a scholarly debate about whether the spread of weighers and coin economies post-plague marked the beginning of capitalism. Some say yes, it was the moment labor became marketable, negotiable, portable. Others say it was a blip before the powerful clamped down again. But here in this village, in this moment, it feels like something different. It feels like recognition that your time has value. Your work can be measured in something other than survival. One night at the tavern, you overhear 2 men arguing over the value of a coin with a faded king's head on it. One insists it's still good. The other says it's cursed. They arm wrestle over it. Naturally, you buy them both a drink to shut them up, and the tavern keep accepts your payment without even raising an eyebrow. A year ago, he wouldn't have taken your money. A year ago, you didn't have money. You walk home in the dark with a flickering lantern and the chip knife in your belt. Your thoughts full of numbers and trade routes and imaginary ledgers. You don't understand how the world works yet. No one does. But you're starting to understand your own worth inside it. You pass a beggar on the edge of the village, half blind, hand out, silent. You drop a coin into his palm and nod. Not charity, solidarity. That's how this new world will have to work. Not out of pity, but out of partnership. We build it together, or we don't build at all. And with each coin that changes hands, it feels like maybe we can build it. It starts with whispers, a raised voice in a tavern, a heated exchange of the market between a grain seller and a local reeve. You catch fragments. Not fair too much. Didn't sign up for this. Then the whispers become shouts, and the shouts become slogans. That's how these things always begin, isn't it? Not with torches and pitchforks, but with muttered complaints over sour ale and badly baked bread. You don't think of it as a revolt at first. It's more like a tension with a pulse. Something under the skin. People aren't quite angry yet, but they're definitely not content. You can feel it in the fields, workers grumbling while they swing sides. You hear it in the churchyard where a young man refuses to bow to the local steward and walks away like he owns the grass. No one stops him. No one knows if they can anymore. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Once people get a taste of power, they don't forget it. And after the plague, with all the death and desperation, they got more than a taste. They got a full meal, better pay, more choices, softer lords. Now, slowly, those lords want to rewind the clock. But the laborers, they're not interested in pretending like none of that happened. Here's your historical fact. In the decades following the Black Death, there was a notable increase in peasant revolts across Europe. The most famous was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where thousands marched on London in protest of taxes, wage controls, and the reassertion of feudal obligations. It was part rebellion, part reckoning, and entirely inevitable. In Bentmere, it begins with a tax collector. He's not even from around here, just some soft-faced man in a crisp tunic with a pouch full of ledgers and a voice too smooth for his own safety. He tells you the Lord has re-established customary dues, which to no one's surprise means higher payments, more grain, and no discussion. He posts the decree in the square and expects to be fed afterward. He is not fed. Instead, someone throws a cabbage at him. It's old and rubbery, but still hits with a satisfying thap. The tax man stumbles back, stunned more by the disrespect than the vegetable. He threatens fines, prison wrath. No one flinches. He leaves that afternoon red-faced and furious. You never see him again, but something clicks in that moment. Not revolution, not yet, but something very close to the idea of it. People begin to meet in secret, or what passes for secret in a village where gossip moves faster than rats. They talk about rights, dues, fairness. Words like freeman and tenant get thrown around with surprising fluency. You listen quietly from the edge of the crowd. You're not sure if you're ready to pick a side. You're just trying to survive like always. But now survival might mean standing up instead of ducking down. Fringe fact, in parts of France, post-plague uprisings were led by groups called the Jacquerie, composed mostly of poor farmers who attacked manor houses, burned tax records, and sometimes even executed officials. Many wore makeshift armor or carried tools as weapons, scythes, axes, sharpened sticks. They weren't soldiers. They were exhausted. The line between protest and rebellion is thin, and in Bentmere, it's wearing out fast. A few younger men refuse to work the Lord's fields. One woman tears up a summons for court dues and burns it in her hearth. No one moves against them. The Lord's steward has grown cautious, almost wary. He no longer rides through the village with that stiff-backed arrogance. You haven't seen him in weeks. There's a sense that the old rules are breaking, not loudly, not with a bang, but like the store crumbling of wet parchment. The world that insisted peasants must kneel is losing its grip. The world where voices from below must be sent is learning what they sound like when they rise. And still not everyone is ready for change. The older folk, those who survive both famine and plague, worry aloud about chaos. Better the devil. They say, don't poke the sleeping lion. You see fear in their eyes, not of punishment, but of instability. They've already lived through too much, lost too many. They want peace, even if it's unequal. There's a scholarly debate around this, whether post-plague revolts were truly revolutionary or just brief flare-ups born of desperation. Some argue they were expressions of new political consciousness, proto-democratic movements in a feudal world. Others say they were instinctive responses to suffering, more survival tactic than ideology. You think maybe it's both. Maybe when people are pushed hard enough, fighting back becomes its own kind of logic. One evening, the villagers meet beneath the elm tree in the square. It's not a formal gathering. No one's declared a council. But there's a weight to it, a shape, a discussion. People speak of sending someone to negotiate with the Lord directly to propose a new arrangement. Lower dues, fair contracts, mutual respect. They don't use words like reform or petition. They say talk like they're asking for a favor instead of demanding a future. You volunteer to cook a knot because you're brave, not because you're angry, just because you've walked the most roads lately, and that seems to qualify you. They hand you a folded sheet of parchment and a loaf of bread. You leave before dawn. The path to the manor is overgrown, the gate half-hinged, the grounds eerily quiet. When you finally meet the Lord, he's sitting in a crumbling study with a moth-eaten cloak and a blank stare. He listens as you read. He does not laugh. He does not smile. He only nods and says, "I'll consider it." When you return to the village, you're hailed like someone important. You're not. You're just a voice. But right now, voices are everything. And maybe, just maybe, that's where revolutions begin. You don't notice it at first. Not exactly. It begins in the background, like a whisper under loud conversations. The blacksmith's son is buying finer wool. The baker's daughter is reading letters out loud in Latin. Someone opens a shop that doesn't sell bread or tools or anything you actually need. It sells glass beads. Useless, beautiful, expensive, and people buy them anyway. You tilt your head. Something's happening here. It's the ones in the middle, not the lords, not the field hands, the ones who sit between, neither landed nor landless. Merchants, millers, skilled tradesfolk, people with ink on their fingers and ledgers in their pockets. You've always known they existed, maybe passed them on the road or bought from them at a market. But now they're moving differently. Straighter backs, heavier purses, and occasionally shoes that don't look like they have ever touched manure. This is the